Hi, I'm your state treasurer, Colleen Davis. Thanks for joining me today for another episode of Treasury Talks, where we're chatting with thought leaders here in Delaware to examine the current state of affairs and how Delaware is weathering the storm of COVID-19. Today, we have a special guest that I have the utmost respect for, State Senator Trey Pardee. Senator Pardee, thank you for joining me today. You were first elected in 2012 to serve the House of Representatives before being elected to the State Senate in 2018. You serve on a diverse portfolio of committees in the State Senate, including as chair of the Senate Banking and Business Committee. You're also the chair of the Environmental and Natural Resources Committee and a member on the esteemed Joint Finances Committee. What has your experience been serving your constituents?
Gosh, it's been a total of 8 years now, and it's been very rewarding. And the community that I currently represent, I represent the city of Dover and the towns of Camden and Wyoming. It's a very diverse community, many different faiths, people of every color, and I'm very proud to have this opportunity.
You've been extremely important championing and sponsoring legislation to support ABLE accounts. Tell us why you're so devoted to issues advocating for children and families with special needs.
Well, I think it's important that we as elected officials stand up for those who can't necessarily stand up for themselves, or those who are frequently marginalized or overlooked. And kind of the quick story is back in, I guess it was late 2014, early 2015, I read a story in the news that Chris Coons, our United States Senator, had been involved in the effort to pass this legislation on the federal level, along with some really wonderful activists here from Delaware, Rick and Amy Kosmowski, and their daughter, Princess Kayla. They were involved in that effort to get the ABLE legislation passed on the federal level. But in order for it to take effect in Delaware, there would have to be enabling legislation for that. And being someone who is involved in finance, I thought that was something that I could be helpful in doing. So I began working on legislation for that, and shortly thereafter found out that Representative Melanie George Smith was also working on legislation along with Senator Poore, and so we all collaborated and came up with a really great piece of legislation. It had overwhelming support, and then in the aftermath of that, I served on the task force that was involved in selecting and setting up the plan that is currently in effect in your office.
You took your two really strong passions, right? Finance and supporting the marginalized. And you merged them and really came away with this immensely impactful program, these accounts. And how would you say that we can continue to advance these issues through legislation, whether it be ABLE tax deduction legislation as an example, or more awareness of these accounts within the community? Where do you think the work needs to continue?
Well, I think you really touched on the two main points that should be considered. And one of the things that you and I have talked about in the past is the idea of creating a tax deduction to give people more incentive to contribute money into ABLE 529 accounts. That has been done in other states. Unfortunately, Delaware has not really been in a position cash-wise in terms of our budget to allow that, because there effectively would be some cost to the state in order to do that.
So no lawmaker wants to tell constituents that they have to pay more in taxes, but in light of the economic uncertainty that we're facing in Delaware, how difficult is the job of a Joint Finance Committee member?
I've only been on the Joint Finance Committee for 2 years, but But one of the things that we were really grateful and fortunate was that this past year is that we did not raise anyone's taxes. We did not cut any state employees, so nobody lost their jobs. And then also what was, I think, very important to myself and a lot of the other committee members was that we did not have to make any cuts in the grant and aid funding. And that's the funding that goes to such things like our fire companies, our senior centers, and to a lot of nonprofits that provide really critical services to the elderly and to children and to folks who are less fortunate in our communities up and down the state. So we ended up the year in pretty good shape. We didn't have to make any real cuts in terms of what the budget had been the prior year. We just weren't able to do as much good as we would have liked to have done. Now, going into this coming year, right now there's a lot of uncertainty. We really don't know the full effect of COVID-19 in terms of how it's going to affect our business revenues through the state. So I think we're going to have to be very, very cautious and be prepared to tighten our belts.
Just the fact that coming to a close this year, this fiscal year, you were able to come up with a budget that reflected some of that downturn and sort of, yes, we didn't have to make big cuts. And so that was really wonderful. And I think extremely thoughtful in the way that you approached it. I commend you for that because it certainly wasn't easy. I think one of the things that I want to remind people of is the fact that you by trade are a financial and wealth advisor. And, there are a lot of Delawareans that are looking at their retirement savings accounts right now, and they're concerned about their future. They're getting a bit nervous. You see these families in Delaware, hurt by the pandemic and the economic downturn. How do you see them getting out of this? And how can we provide some confidence for them as public servants?
Well, a lot of it is really going to come down to how we as a society or we as a state adapt to this reality that we find ourselves in. And I think that we can get businesses back up and running fully, but it's going to require a lot of discipline. And unfortunately, we're just not seeing that up and down the state or really throughout the country like we'd like to. And it's pretty simple, wearing masks and washing our hands and maintaining our distances. But, unfortunately, not everyone seems to want to get on board with that. And so, we just continue to kind of flounder in terms of, really getting the economy, restarted. We see, other countries in Europe and in Asia that have adapted very well. And unfortunately, a lot of Americans aren't learning their lessons quickly enough. But, the sooner that we can get everyone back to work, the better off, we'll all be. That's what we really got to stay focused on.
A lot of businesses have been very thoughtful about trying to do that. And I think they've been successful. And so if we can continue to do that and protect ourselves, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
It's interesting. You asked about how families are dealing with it. And that really varies from family to family. But I've also noticed a lot of folks, and this is true of my own household, we're not spending as much, not going out to dinner as often, not traveling. So I think with the uncertainty in the economy, a lot of folks having uncertainty with their work, people are kind of pulling in their spending.
Yeah. And, it's the more saving, which may end up being very effective for folks. And I think you're right. I think there's a lot of work to be done, though. And I really appreciate all of your efforts. Thank you so much for spending the time with me today.
I really enjoyed speaking with you today and look forward to working with you in the future.